Back in 2022, we got what I would consider one of the greatest video games ever made, Elden Ring, which is easily From Software's crowning achievement. From the sales numbers to the cultural impact from the game, really cementing Souls-like into the mainstream, it was just awesome to see that shift as a whole new group of people experience this style of game for the first time. Though with saying that, if you wanted to argue Bloodborne, Sekiro, or any of the other Souls games are better, I don't believe your opinion would be wrong, because you can easily point to each one of From Software games and find something it does better compared to the others, which while Elden Ring for me was a truly magical experience, I was still on the fence if I liked it more than Dark Souls 3, which was at the time my favorite From Software game, because to me, the boss fights were simply unmatched in the game, definitely when you factor in the DLCs, but with the introduction of Shadow of the Erdtree, Elden Ring is not only my favorite From Software game now, it's probably a top 5 game of all time for me. With that said, after putting in well over 100 plus hours into Shadow of the Erdtree and exploring every painstaking corner I could find, while I consider it a masterpiece, it is a flawed masterpiece like any other, because no matter how perfect any one game is, there will always be something wrong because there is no such thing as perfection in the video game world, and as amazing as Shadow of the Erdtree is, there are parts I feel it does miss with. Also, I do want to note there will be spoilers in this video. I will not show the final boss or say its name, nor will I show every boss imaginable, but I will show some of them just for some of the points I want to make. Definitely when it comes to what has probably been the most controversial part of the DLC, which is the difficulty. Also, I will be diving a little bit into some of the more hidden areas, just to talk about what I like and dislike about them, so you have been warned. Now let's go ahead and dive into the world of Shadow of the Erdtree, starting with the world itself, the Land of Shadows. So I found the Land of Shadows to be one of the most uniquely designed open worlds I've experienced, and it goes even more against the grain than the base game did. What I mean by this is most open world games do a good job of easily guiding the player to wherever the objective they need to reach is, while laying out these easy to find side quests and dungeons thanks to the lands you explore in these games being so easy to navigate. Not to mention you always usually have a map marker showing you where to go. Now, I'm not saying there aren't huge hidden secrets in other open world games to find, but the way FromSoft is able to hide entire massive areas of a map from players is absolutely astounding. There were so many sections of the map I couldn't figure out how to get to, that it blew my mind once I finally figured out how to get to it, like the Abyssal Woods. It wasn't until I was about to head off to the final boss that I finally figured out how to reach them. So there's this drop off here that leads past a fly village that goes down to a foggy area with a dungeon that leads to the Abyssal Woods, which by the way, the dungeons actually have a nice variety in the DLC and don't feel so copy and pasted, with some cool bosses. But anyway, I was like, what the hell is this? And I mean that in the best way possible. It's crazy how, unlike most other open world games, Shadow of the Erdtree makes me want to check every little possible nook and cranny to make sure I don't miss something, because it's not like I'm finding worthless collectibles for a completionist's sake. I'm finding truly meaningful content that I would otherwise completely miss if I didn't dig deep into the world, and doing this rewards me with brand new armor, spells, and weapons. It leads to one-of-a-kind boss encounters. It leads to what I believe to be some of the most interesting NPC encounters in this type of From Software game. They know how to make an open world truly meaningful to explore, which Shadow of the Erdtree does beautifully by capturing that interconnectivity that made the first Dark Souls so special, but they cranked the verticality up to 11. It's just so cool how I can cross a bridge and look down just to think to myself, yeah, that's definitely not an area, and then bam! 10 hours later, I'm exploring down there. From Software really does nail the whole if you can see it, you can go to it so well. Also, another thing I loved about the DLC is while I was talking to a friend, I asked him what he thought of the R'hllana boss fight, because that was the first fight I really had any kind of trouble on, which I'll get to after a bit. But he was fighting Mesmer, so I just figured he had done that fight. Turns out he had no idea who I was talking about. There's a spirit jump you can do that bypasses that entire area in boss fight, and stuff like that I always find so interesting, and makes it interesting to explore since FromSoft does a good job of making you understand what your main objective is, but how you get to it is kind of up to you to figure out, since the jagged vertical landscapes of the Lands of Shadow really obscure your vision on how you can progress. I mean, you only actually have to fight 3 bosses to beat the DLC if you know where to go, which is pretty interesting, but not as interesting as the varied landscapes of the DLC. The variety of areas is one of my favorite things about the DLC. From the glowing blue fields of flowers in the Cerulean Coast to the thundering clouds of the jagged mountain peak full of dragons, the art direction is some of the best I've seen in a video game, which is great since you have something pleasant to look at while digging for secrets or fighting those pesky Shadow Tree and Revered Spirit Ash blessings, which is the main leveling items used in the DLC to power up your character summons and your trusty steed turret. Now at this point you might believe I don't think From Software has done no wrong with the world and exploration, but unfortunately, like I said before, nothing is perfect, and that includes the Land of Shadows. There are too many areas that are just overly empty. Now, I do think having empty areas can serve a purpose in a game like this, where so much of the storytelling is told through the environments and act as a breathing spot between encounters. Like how even though the shaman village is empty, having it next to the fingerprint ruins doesn't feel like a coincidence, not to mention it has an item that ties pretty cool into the lore and personally helped me massively with the final boss. But this is also a video game, and places like the fingerprint ruins didn't need to be as large as they are, or the area behind Shadowkeep Castle past the fight with Commander Gaius. You have this giant structure which I was excited to explore, just for it to turn out to be nothing. Like, this entire area is so empty for no real reason. They should have at least put a giant fire golem here, or another boss. Better yet, instead of fighting Commander Gaius in that field, they should have made it to where he was at the structure and you had to battle through a large enemy encampment to get to him. Just would have been a better setup overall, and this applies to a variety of areas. Like the Abyssal Woods, this area is awesome with a cool gimmick that leans hard into the more horror aspects of a FromSoft game. You have to crouch through grass to avoid these frenzied creatures, while also avoiding these plants that will make sounds that will attract them. But this is only used in a few spots, with a majority of the Abyssal Woods being like any other area. Like, I really wish they would have made the woods a little more compact, but with a complete focus on these sneaking mechanics while throwing in some more fodder enemies that act as stressful encounters that have to be dealt with quickly while sneaking, would have really took a cool experience and truly made it one of a kind. Then finally, I'm not a fan of having to explore to gain upgrades in Shadow of the Erdtree. I feel like it really goes against the core principle of what Souls games are all about. Your main way of leveling up has always been killing enemies and bosses to farm souls or whatever the game's currency is that you spend on levels, which is perfect because, at least for me, when doing repeated playthroughs, I'm not looking to explore every nook and cranny like I do on a first playthrough. I've already experienced that aspect of the game. Now I'm focused on either running a certain build that doesn't require me to explore everywhere. I might be making a PvP character, maybe do a fun co-op run, and the list goes on. Earning souls, runes, or whatever to make yourself stronger should always be a streamlined experience that doesn't force you to go out of your way of how you want to play the game. So what I wish they would have done is made it so more bosses were mandatory, got rid of the blessing system, and made it so with each mandatory boss killed, you just got a baseline buff from them. So let's just say they made it so Dancing Lion and Rolana were now required bosses. That would make 5 required bosses to beat the game. So excluding the final boss, the other 4 bosses could have gave a baseline buff of, let's say, 25% each, or something to that effect. Doing this would have made it so repeated playthroughs didn't require so much exploring to make your character stronger. At least that's how I feel about it. Don't get me wrong, I don't think the system they made is terrible, and it makes sense in terms of trying to keep players from just one-shotting every boss in the DLC coming into it. It's actually great for that initial playthrough, but it just falls short for me on repeated playthroughs. But now I think it's time we tackle the most important question of all. Is the DLC really that difficult? Is it really From Software's hardest DLC ever? Well, honestly, I can't remember exactly how much trouble I had with their other DLCs they made, since it's been so long since I've played any of them. so I might have to make a video replaying back through all of them to refresh myself. But going from my personal experience with Shadow of the Erdtree, which by the way, I entered the DLC at level 125, this was the only character I had that wasn't in New Game Plus, so it seemed like a solid choice, and by the end of the DLC I was level 150, I maxed out my Revered Spirit Ash Blessing, and as for my Shadow Tree Blessing, it was level 19. I have no idea where I missed some Shadow Tree fragments for the final level, so it is what it is. Also, I chose to not use summons for my DLC playthrough for a little extra challenge so I could really understand the difficulty of some of these boss fights. Well, except for the fight with Bale the Dread, because Aigon is the coolest NPC on the planet, and that voice actor went so fucking hard for no reason in that fight. Plus, while I think dragons can be terrible to fight based on what your build is in Elden Ring, Bale is one of the greatest fights FromSoft has ever made, and I will die on that hill. Anyway, getting back to difficulty, I actually didn't think it was that bad and was surprised by how low my death count actually was. In total, I had 96 deaths in the DLC. 27 came to the final boss because he is a pain in the ass. But other ones I've seen people have trouble with, like Commander Gaius and Mesmer, I beat both in 5 tries. But bosses like R'Lana and Golden Hippo both took me over 10, which I think R'Lana and Mesmer are terrifically crafted fights that once you understand how to manipulate the AI, they're not bad to fight at all. But Commander Gaius has some terrible hitboxes, and Golden Hippo might be the worst fight in the entire game to me. While the final boss appears really hard at first, once you understand how to dodge the attacks, it becomes decently easy. But the Golden Hippo fight is absolutely garbage just because of how shitty the camera can be in that fight. It has nothing to do with the enemy moveset, though I do think the bite attack has a pretty strange hitbox. The biggest battle of that fight is the camera, and I hate it. When you fight the other hippos out in the open, instantly no issues, but once you're in a tight area, the camera becomes a nightmare. And this is something that is shared with a couple different bosses, like the Dancing Lion or Blood Fiend. I found it almost more beneficial to fight them and other bosses without ever locking on or occasionally disabling lock-on, because it was almost more punishing using it. I'm not sure how something like this could be fixed, maybe making these enemies smaller in scale so the camera isn't so jumpy, but it was pretty annoying at times. Another thing is, I really hate how we are limited in respecs. It serves absolutely no purpose, and to me, creates an artificial difficulty. When people are struggling with a boss, it would be nice to have that option to freely switch builds on the fly, so you can at least experiment a little more. Definitely with all of these new weapons and spells, I actually used up all 9 of my larval tiers, respecting to try a variety of the new weapons. And yes, obviously being a low level as I am limits my options a lot more. I do it just because I like to do PvP in the 125 to 150 range, but I just don't get why we can't have it so respecs just cost runes. Like 500,000 gets your respect, or something to that effect. That way you are rewarded for playing the game and still have that pressure of if I die, I could lose my ability to respect. So it's still faithful to that core mechanic, and it doesn't give players that fear of using rare resources. With that said, speaking of weapons, my favorite outside of the giant throwable jars ended up being the Great Sword of Solitude. It's basically a physical version of my favorite weapon in the game, the Dark Moon Greatsword, and I had a blast running around smashing enemies with it. But in terms of actual new weapon types, my 2 favorites have to be the Dueling Shield and Dryleaf Arts. They're just a blast to use, and really all the new weapon types were fun to use. They did a good job with all the new weapons in the DLC and added some really cool special moves with a lot of them, though I do think there's a few too many weapons to have 3 and 4-way scaling in the DLC. Like, it's very punishing to people who play at levels under 175, so I wish they didn't get so aggressive with that. Also, I feel like if you're intelligence build, you kind of got shafted overall in the weapon department. I found all of the intelligent-based weapons to be mostly a letdown thanks to how they scaled with intelligence, leading to the best intelligent weapons just being stuff like the Dryleaf Arts or backhand blades being infused with magic or cold, though I do think the Perfumer Ice Bottle and Carrion Thrusting Shield are fantastic. Now as for everyone else, you're eating real good with this DLC. But getting back to the difficulty stuff, it's so hard to really say this is hard and this isn't when it comes to these games. Between factoring in how a new player is to this style of game and how different builds are from person to person, it's ridiculous trying to figure out if something is truly as hard as someone believes. Not to mention, in my opinion, it feels like so many people try to overly brute force their way through bosses without taking time to prepare. Like the final boss, for example. If you take your time to explore and get to certain items, it helps tremendously with that fight. Talismans in general helped me survive in so many fights, and I feel like people don't really respect how much they actually helped, especially in this DLC. I couldn't even imagine how tough Mesmer would have been without the final Flame Drake Talisman to cut back that fire damage, and honestly, this all applies to me too. I'm not innocent by any means. I can't remember when I was this engaged in the weapons, armors, mechanics, and talismans I used, which I had a blast with. I really felt like the equipment RPG part of Elden Ring was finally important to the point it determined whether or not I was going to survive a fight, which I loved. Because with how aggressive these bosses are, you don't have a lot of time to heal, so you need to be able to tank some hits so you can learn the patterns you're up against, which luckily Elden Ring puts you right before bosses, so these retries don't require ridiculously long runbacks. I'm looking at you, Dark Souls. But basically, in general, while I do believe the DLC is much harder compared to the base game, I think after a couple of months go by and the dust settles, people will look back and probably think this isn't as hard as I thought it was. Because outside of the bosses, in terms of actually exploring the world, that part is fairly easy, minus some difficult new enemies that definitely power check you right away in the DLC. I died more times to fall damage than enemies when exploring. And even when it comes to bosses, minus some BS hitboxes and camera angles, once people get down how to force certain attacks and avoid others more easily, it won't be so bad. I mean, look at Melania. Everyone got destroyed by Waterfowl Dance when the game first came out, and now it's pretty easy to avoid that attack or stop it altogether if you throw a jar at her. Though, like I said before, if we had no limit on how much we could respect our characters, a lot more players would probably have more fun learning boss fights, since they could change up their playstyles a lot more, and not get stuck in this almost repetitive robotic mindset as they do the same thing over and over again, because there's just no humanly possible way to design a boss around every possible build out there. But with that said, I do believe people should focus on some more serious issues like performance. For me, performance got a little spotty at times, from some aggressive pop-in when loading into a zone to some massive frame drops in some areas, especially when helping out other players or fighting the dancing lion in specific. It wasn't the best, at least not for me while I was playing on my Series X, so it would be nice to see some updates to the performance, definitely with a world this fun to explore, from the bosses to the really cool NPCs that I surprisingly found myself invested into, and they all had a final that really was epic to experience. Not to mention, the endless secrets to find that I cannot state enough really does reward you for your hard work and exploration. From Software absolutely knocked Shadow of the Erdtree out of the park despite some of the flaws it had, and whatever comes next, I have no problem saying From Software is one of the few developers I have total faith in, because if they can recapture that feeling Elden Ring gave me for the first time playing it in a DLC, they could capture that feeling in a new game.